As we move into the historic, or if you would, the European period, it's important to remember that Hawaii was one of very complex places we've seen before. And two is that I think, at least in my personal opinion, in part the insights that Kamehameha had of the Europeans, you had a very complicated relationship here, I think more so than you did in the rest of the Pacific, simply because the Europeans had this combination of, on one hand, they had the sort of the Polynesian noble savage, children of Eden logic that they sort of laid on Polynesians like Hawaiians. Then on the other hand, you also had the, largely freestanding, pre-existing state that Kamehameha builds himself at the time that the Europeans actually start to show up in force. You remember he was only a high chief of part of the islands when Vancouver shows up. But within, 6 or 7 years, he's controlling basically all of the islands. So by the time the Europeans start to show up in numbers, the French expeditions, the Dutch expedition, the Russian expeditions, all the traders that come to live here in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the Hawaiian monarchy was sort of de facto a given. And this made it radically different than anywhere else in the Pacific. You had like Pomare and Tahiti who controlled some islands, but there really wasn't any sense of freestanding, indigenous European style political systems in the rest of the Pacific. And so the Europeans sort of make this weird combination of noble savages. So Polynesians are actually are basically our Europeans in the Pacific. And then when you combine that with the fact that you have a political system that has a quote king unquote and a whole structured bureaucracy, et cetera, and the social structures, especially the sort of caste system that's in place, that very much is reminiscent to the Europeans of their own period of say the medieval period, or even into the Renaissance. So if you would, the Hawaiian version of Queen Elizabeth I court or Henry VIII's court, and so they see Hawaiians as being really well tanned, dark haired versions of themselves rather than being savages in the way that they saw indigenous populations in the Americas or even in the rest of the Pacific. And so it sort of becomes hands off in terms of messing with the Hawaiians initially. One is they had the political and military power to pretty much enforce their own rule. And secondly, as you have to remember, until pretty much the 1830s, the Europeans that are living in Hawaii are here at the behest of the kingdom. Kamehameha could and did throw people out. Kaumano, who becomes the premier after he passes away, was very prone to chucking people out of Hawaii. So the Europeans were not in a position of power. Something that's really aggravating if you know anything about this place is people are constantly saying, well, Cook came here and Hawaii became, an American state. Well, Cook died here. And there was basically 40 years of Hawaiians figuring out what they were going to do with the Europeans. The missionaries don't arrive until 1821, after the Hawaiians have gotten rid of their old religious system, which is the one that we saw last time. The Pa'au religion gets essentially nuked by Kaumanu as a political strategy for the Kamehameha family, which we don't have time to get into this class. But it's important to remember that the Hawaiians themselves, or the Hawaiian royal family, basically destroys the traditional religious system intentionally for a way to stabilize their own power based on what they're interpreting as a European, i.e. British model. So the Hawaiians weren't trying to be the British, but the Hawaiians were using the British system, which they knew had been around for a while by then. And you have to remember, these folks are actually pretty cosmopolitan. By the time we're in the 1810, 1815 period, there's a ton of Europeans living here. There's a ton of Europeans who are basically working directly for the Kamehameha family. I mean, Young and Davis are both British seamen who were married into the Kamehameha family. So they have a huge amount of insight into how the Europeans operate and function and how they do stuff. And they don't have any huge fascination of being Europeans, but they are very cognizant of the fact that the monarchy and the Hawaiian system is very unstable. It was going through huge amounts of change. The Pa'au religion being a good example. And so if you wanted stability, then you were going to have to some sort of invent this, if you would. And so being like the Europeans or using the European system as a model becomes paramount for the high chiefs, or I should say the chiefly families. The other thing that gets in the way of all this, however, is right from the get-go, and this becomes a huge issue with actually Cook's initial arrival. Not so much on Niihau, Kauai when he first arrives here, but when he comes back to the Big Island later the same year. The people think of normally as the big arrival. The Hawaiian population, both Ari and Makainana, have come to the conclusion that the European technology, especially the European access to metals, especially copper and iron, meant that the Europeans had mana. Because you have to remember, one of the aspects of mana that you get throughout the Pacific, and in fact in most societies, including Asian concept of chi, is it has to do with intellectual energy, but it also has to do with things that you know. So in the traditional Hawaiian system, someone who was a tonga or a teacher, Chinese would call them a shufu, they had mana not only because they were, theoretically smart, but they also had mana because everything they knew was in itself a generator of mana. So folks that were really knowledgeable had lots of mana. And this is one reason I think why you find the Tongas tend to be limited to the EID-GE, because there's this sort of monopoly of mana in the upper, caste system by the 1700s. So when the Europeans arrived, the Europeans have all this new technology, they have this all new knowledge, and they have writing, all of which by European logic, by Hawaiian logic, because you have to remember, people are seeing this from their own point of view. From the Hawaiian point of view, that means the Europeans have lots of mana. Now, they're very confused about this because a lot of the Europeans don't, particularly, especially the seamen and stuff, are not particularly smart. So they're obviously not smart mana, but they have stuffed mana. And so the Hawaiians very quickly come to the conclusion that European things have mana inherent into them, which makes sense because in the Hawaiian context, stones and trees and places had mana, so why wouldn't the European stuff? So acquiring European things, because they inherently have mana, especially if they're exotic or different, becomes a huge, almost addiction of almost all the chiefs. Because by the time the Kamehameha is consolidating authority, you're not allowed to kill each other anymore. You don't have the wars going on to make one family dominant or one individual dominant by taking over their neighbors, putting them on a heiau, and sacrificing them, and therefore, stabilizing your authority. That's gone. Kamehameha won't allow it. And so what you have folks that basically had defined themselves by their ability to conquer others, who suddenly find themselves unable to do that anymore. And there's a lot of different ways you could go about it, but the way that the Hawaiian elites went about it is they shifted this aggressive need to be successful and superior into the acquisition of things. And so what happens is the more things that you have equal the more European things that you have, especially the more exotic European things that you have, the more mana you have. And the more mana that you have, the more that you're dominant over your neighbors. So what you get is you basically get what would in North America be called potlatch. What you get is economic warfare between individuals and families for prestige and status through the acquisition of things. Now, the difference with European or even, say, Calvinist concept of stuff is the Euro-American Calvinist concept is based on sort of a generalized acceptance of the value of a particular thing, the value of a horse, the value of a plow, the value of a shovel or a gun was standardized. And so if you had these things, everyone knew what the value was. And then that's the system we have today. In the Hawaiian system, the value was in the mana that was in the object, not the cost of the object. So it wasn't so much how much something cost, it was the interpreted mana that it had. So something that was cheap but very strange might very well have more mana than something that's expensive but fairly common. So for example, alcohol like champagne and stuff really didn't have much mana, even though it was very expensive. On the other hand, when Leo buys some chandeliers from Austria, from Vienna, those have a lot of mana because they're cut crystal, and when they hang up to catch the light, and they're really different and no one else has got them. And so even though they are expensive, but more importantly, because they're really, really different, they're seen as having a lot of mana because obviously it took a lot of skill to make them. They're very, very rare, and so therefore they must be high in mana. And so what happens is Hawaiians get into consumerism or consumption. And a lot of times I think there's a mistake of assuming it's the same thing, but it's not. The reasons for consuming are different. In the Calvinist world or the North American world, the Virginia City world of North America, you do this to, one, impress your neighbors, be better than your neighbors, but you're also doing it for moral purposes. You have to remember, if you're a Calvinist, you have a white picket fence because it shows you're a good person, and you're good with God, and you're going to go to heaven. So there's this huge moral system that goes right down until today in the American system of things equal morality, or if you would, lack of things equal lack of morality. In the Hawaiian system, it had to do with mana. People weren't interested in how people interpreted their morality because if you think about it, in both the traditional and the Pa'al period of the Hawaiian system, you don't have morality. What you have is mana. People did a lot of stuff that would be technically immoral in the Christian world, but it wasn't that they were intentionally being immoral. They just didn't have that context and they didn't see it that way. And in part, you could argue that still folks that are fairly traditionally Hawaiian, they don't operate off the European system. And in part, you have to remember this goes way back to earlier, a couple of presentations ago, in the fact that if Hawaiians are clans, as they traditionally in some ways still see themselves, then their relationship with people outside of the clan is not in anything related to the Euro-American concept of the human species. So if you have clans who are basically pockets of human beings, but also include animals, another pocket of human beings, which includes animals, these two pockets don't see each other as being similar. And so therefore, if someone like a missionary comes in the 1820s and start lecturing them about morality, they're sort of thinking, well, why would I care what my neighbors do? They're not part of my family. And to a certain extent, they're looking at the missionary and they're thinking, well, you're not part of my family, so why do I care what you think? So people exist in sort of pockets of not so much isolation, but within enormous interest and outside pretty much disinterest. And so the whole European concept of, or Euro-American concept of acquisition of things to impress your neighbors with the impersonal, basically of sort of everyone competitively shopping, it is not the way that the Hawaiians operate. They had a different system of logic, and that logic, and there's still parts of that logic around today. It hasn't completely disappeared. So it's important to remember when the Europeans come here for the first 40 years, they're operating within the Hawaiian system. They're operating under the chiefs, and they're very much on tolerance of the chiefs. You piss the chiefs off, and you're out of here if you're not dead. At least in their late 1700s, very frequently Europeans were killed. So they're not in a position of telling the Hawaiians what to do. And so what happens is Hawaiians interpret what they see of the European world. The Europeans come over here and they live in Hawaiian homes, but very quickly they want to have something more like home. So in many ways, Hawaii looks a lot like Virginia City. You try to make this sort of variant temporary form here so that you can make money, but the idea that you're going to go back to London or you're going to go back to Boston, you're going back to San Francisco when you get the money up. So in many ways, the Europeans arriving here are entrepreneurs or folks trying to make a quick buck. Having said that, that's one reason why when you look at Honolulu right into the late 19th century, and especially even more so Lahaina, what you get is it looks a lot like Virginia City or another Western, gold rush or silver rush settlement. And that's the reason why. Now the Hawaiians are watching all this. They're seeing the Europeans build their interpretation of a house. And they come to the conclusion in some cases, one, it's a bad idea. But in other situations, they start to grasp this idea that to Europeans, defining space, defining property on individual terms is a real handy way because this too can be interpreted in one sense as mana. The more property that I have, the fence I have around my house, the fact that my house is now bigger becomes another form of specific acquisition, i.e. mana. Now, in the 1820s, of course, then what you get is the missionaries come in from New England. And it's important to remember that they come in here, but they are tolerated because the royal family has just wiped out the traditional Hawaiian religious system as much as they could. And so they're in desperate need of a new religion to keep the population stable. You have to envision what would happen in the United States if suddenly Christianity was disappeared tomorrow. Our entire legal system, you swear in a Bible. I mean, the entire American system is based in Christianity. There's a pretense of separation of church and state, but it's not there. So all of a sudden, if you get rid of Christianity and people don't believe in it anymore, you're going to have enormous political, social, economic disruption because people's value system is just going to be literally tanked. And that's what happens in Hawaii. So they're going through this enormous instability, self-inflicted. And then all of a sudden the missionaries show up by chance, literally within 6 months of this happening. So the royal family jumps on the missionaries and basically embraces them and says, you're our new religion. And this is why the missionaries get such quick traction here, because the royal family uses them for their own political, social, economic purposes. And the missionaries they think this is fantastic. They come over here, they don't have to compete with the traditional religion. They don't have to preach, give up your old gods for the new God, because the old gods have already been sort of wiped. And so for them, it's a fantastic situation. And so one of the ways that this happens very spectacularly, and a good example would be Papa'e'e'e Waikiki, is the fact that the high chiefs then very quickly and a huge proportion of them become Christian, embrace Calvinist, uniformitarianism that comes over here in 1821. And one of the first things they do is they start putting down both Christian, or more accurately Calvinist churches, but also their own private homes on top of religious sites, specifically human sacrifice heiau. And this is the high chief's way, or the royal family's way, of basically making a statement that the new religion, the new form of religion, Christianity, is actually more powerful than the old religion that was run by the Tongas. And this becomes their way of basically reinforcing the fact that they'd gotten rid of that religion. And so, if you look at Papa'e'e'e, which was absolutely central to Kamehameha's taking over the island of Oahu, that gets taken over by Queen, I don't remember which one it was, one of his wives, basically moves over there and plops her house down on top of the heiau, strips the heiau out, levels it out, puts her house intentionally on it to prove to everyone, especially everyone beneath her, that she's not afraid of being on a ritual site where women weren't supposed to be, because under the new god, she's protected. The new god is more powerful than the old god, whose heiau that belonged to. And so what you get is if you look at older churches here, churches put up in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, you'll almost invariably find that they're placed on top of heiau. Most famously here would probably be Kauai Hau, if you're going down King Street. The Royal Church was placed on top of a heiau next to the spring, and that again was I think a Lono heiau. But nonetheless, that intention they put it, it's actually based on the foundation is the top of the old heiau. And so what you got was, it was not the Europeans, but actually the Hawaiian elites very quickly made Christianity highly visible by intentionally supplanting the old religion by putting the new religion on top of it. And then, of course, they'd also already made it clear that you're not supposed to practice the old religion in the old religious sites. So first they turn off the old religious sites, if you want to think of it this way. Then what they do is they put new religious and residential sites on top of those old sites to basically enforce the power of the new god. This was a very common strategy. The Spanish did this all throughout their conquest, especially in the New World. In North and South America, almost any place you see a kind of Spanish church, it's built on top of a traditional religious site. And again, for exactly the same very, very, blatant reason, our God's more powerful than your God. Your God can't do anything to our God. So if we look at this period of change, when everyone's trying to decide how they want to do this, what it's going to look like. And so basically what you get is this shift from a Hawaiian landscape, which is basically sleeping structures and basically outside activities collectively as a group, to a much more, over time, a much more American concept. It's basically a version of, if you would, Williamsburg, but even more importantly, basically of something like, say, Virginia City, or miraculously maybe Main Street, which is all happening in this period. You have to remember Virginia City and the Main Street is the period of European sort of consolidation and Hawaiian change to a more American model is in the same period of time. So not surprisingly, it has the same, not necessarily the same logics attached to it, but the same look to it. So let's take a look at the looks. Okay. Oops. What happened there? Okay. So here we've got this is an image, a sketch that was done by one of the expeditionary groups. I can't remember who it was. I'm going to say the Wokes expedition. It's an image of Honolulu in 1835. And it was also an interesting sort of social commentary. Here you have one of the priests or one of the missionaries being towed around by some Hawaiians in a cart that's obviously been locally made. But if you look at the structures here, you see an enormous change with if you visualize those images, I think I showed you last time, of the Hawaiian hale, basically, on an open area, an open lanai in front, and basically folks interacting with a bunch of related clustered, residential structures. This is probably actually this would be Fort Street, since that was the first street that went down to the fort at the waterfront. And so if you notice here, what we've got is actually pretty well done 1830s snapshot of Honolulu, which of course was the center of the European content. Well, It was one of the two centers of the European context. The Euro-Americans were much more in control in Honolulu. The royal family was still residing in Lahaina. So Lahaina was much more sort of a mixed bag in terms of what you had going on there. The Euro-Americans had to be a little more careful in Lahaina because the royal family would put their foot down. I thought things were changing a little too quickly. And in Honolulu, you pretty much whatever the Europeans wanted to do was fine. And so what you get here is you start to get folks building walls. So if you notice, we now got this property is now divvied off. You've now got a shaded lanai in front. You've got some structures. Here's an actually wood structure. You've got some wood type structures. You've got a more traditional house here, but notice again how now everything's been walled off or fenced. We see this in the Mahele testimony we're working on in our project, that you start to get folks defining what's mine and what isn't, or what's mine and what's yours might be another way to look at it. And they're then, especially in urban areas like Honolulu, then defining this by actual physical marking of it. So in this way, they're becoming much closer to the Calvinists in the sense you're now defining personal space in versus a collective or group space, because these folks are not part of a family that resided in Honolulu anymore. These are folks that moved to Honolulu, probably Hawaiian here, European, Euro-Americans, probably Americans, but probably Brits also here. So they're all migrants to the small settlement of Honolulu, and they've made it into a new town. And so no one's actually from here. So they don't have any clan relationships. They don't have any large family relationships to this place. And so now they're going to be thinking in terms of my house, my property, my lanai. And then people interact in the public or outside of it. So you've made this inside outside, very much like its Asian counterparts, becomes part of this world. And this is probably the first striking amount of change. You still largely have thatched roofs, simply because they were practical, they were cooler, and they were much more affordable than its alternatives. But you start to get these changes already becoming pretty significant. And so we're now in the 1840s, or 1840. So now what you're starting to get is you're actually starting to get, I believe this is, this is the Catholic Church. Okay. So I think this is still 4th Street. So what you're starting to get is European style structures. There's a few thatched huts in the background here, but if you notice, most of these starting to look very, very American, very European. And so it's starting to look like a classic sort of migratory or colonial outpost. A huge difference, of course, is this is actually under Hawaiian control. But notice again how you've now got everything's barriered off. You know, much more of a hard line, wooden, or in this case, stacked stone structure. And so this is becoming much more of a European or an American type settlement and a lot less of the Hawaiian settlement. But again, Honolulu was going to be the key part of this because Honolulu was all folks that had moved into Honolulu. I don't know of any records that talk about any of the original folks from the town of Honolulu that were still around in the 1850s during the Mahele. We haven't seen anything in our testimony that we've been looking at. I've been here for 50 years, and so I wasn't here before Honolulu became a town. I've never seen anything like that. So everyone here was from somewhere else, maybe from Kaneohe or from Maui somewhere, or wherever. So the world that they made was in some ways like Virginia City. It was a migratory place, but it's becoming much more visually American. Here we see the third. I forget this guy's name. I'm going to say Ebert, but I'm not sure if that's right. This is actually one of the Thrums readings talks that he actually has his etchings. He did a whole series of these. He was actually commissioned by someone, I think maybe the government, to basically do a set of, I think it was 7 images of almost entirely of Honolulu, showing how Honolulu was now a classic American town. It was basically like San Francisco West. And so the images were almost entirely of American type structures. But this is what Honolulu looked like in 1855. And so, you now had the first steamships were already here. You've got a few, thatched structures, but everything else is very, very much like somewhere between Virginia City and Main Street. So, and San Francisco was actually the model they used because a lot of folks came from San Francisco that moved here from the U.S. And financially, most of the money here was back and forth between San Francisco and Hawaii. Honolulu, very specific, was sort of like the sister city or almost a suburb of San Francisco, financially, socially, etc. And you can see this in the town. And so this is Honolulu in the 1850s. So if you flash back to that 1830 image, only 20 years earlier, 1835, this is 1855, the enormous changes that have turned in Honolulu. Now, it's important to remember the changes are only in Honolulu. If you go up Nuuanu Valley here, if you go up Manoa Valley, you would have found people still living in classic thatched hale, and still, fairly traditional. But already by now, if you moved to this part of the island, you were intentionally volunteering to assimilate into the new world of if you would, the world of the monarchy, the world of Kamehameha III and on, the Hawaiian monarchy as a political institution and a modern state in the 19th century, and a modern place has to look modern. And so what you get is this idea that American architecture or Euro-American architecture becomes a sign of not so much wealth, but more of sophistication, assimilation, and being cosmopolitan. Honolulu was a very, very cosmopolitan, very international town. I was very proud of that. And that's why these images were made, was to show to everyone who had never been here how cosmopolitan it was. It wasn't part of the Pacific. It wasn't a small Pacific settlement with thatched huts, which is sort of ironic because if you think about it, even now, the stereotype of Hawaii Tourism Authority and all that is that folks here live in thatched huts, and there's still thatched huts around. And you still see matting, if you go by the hotels in Waikiki, you see an enormous effort to put in matting on things that make it look more wooden. But in 1850s, everyone was trying really hard to look like a cosmopolitan town that could be anywhere in the world. And that was very much intentional. You didn't want Hawaii, but specifically Honolulu, to look like a little podunk rural place in the middle of nowhere. It had to look like it was real, because politically by 1850, it had already been taken over by the British twice. It'd been taken over by the French once. It had all been given back. But Hawaii was a player in the geopolitical system of the 19th century. And then this is the way that you did that. You had to have the look to match the talk. And so architecture here very quickly becomes part of this way that you manifest your position and your place in the geopolitical realities of the 19th century. And not surprisingly, then, what you're going to get is the high chiefs, Princess Ruth Kealiikalani, Victoria Kamamalu, all these folks that are part of the royal family and other elites are very quickly going to start building European or Euro-American type homes, because they are the rulers of this place, and they have to look like sophisticated urbanites that are fit to rule a country in the 19th century, especially because you have to remember, Hawaii is probably one of the, as far as I know, the only place in the world that was run by an indigenous population in the 19th century that had not been colonized and taken over by the European power, but was treated as an independent country, not treated as a colony or like Tonga as a sort of semi-colony, but actually was an independent country. So the Europeans and Americans might have had ambivalent views of Hawaii and Hawaiians, but they knew the place was serious. And then one of the ways that you did that most expressively was in the built environment you had here. So it's a different built environment than Virginia City. It's a different built environment than Main Street, but it very much serves similar purposes. And it's a way, the huge power of a built environment like this is that it works 24/7. Every time someone looks around them, every time they come here on ship, they're seen and being reminded of this. People don't have to tell you, they don't have to put advertisements, they don't have to put on social media. The buildings talk, and the buildings say, we're a sophisticated, urban, cosmopolitan place in the mid-19th century. And, that's what we are, and we're players.